Let's bring in Miles Taylor, former chief of staff to secretaries of Homeland Security, now spokesperson for endpresidentialrevenge.org, and Michael Weiss, editor at The Insider and co-author of the book ISIS Inside the Army of Terror. Miles, want to get your thoughts on what Secretary Bessent said there, that you have to escalate sometimes to de-escalate. What do you think he means by that, and are you concerned?
Well, I mean, he's not wrong in a geostrategic context, but he's also talking about Donald Trump. And my experience with the man is that his planning is not very well thought out. I mean, I don't mean that facetiously. I mean, I rarely saw him thinking one step beyond the immediacy of his decision making. So maybe the Treasury Secretary anticipates that he would escalate to de-escalate, but Donald Trump doesn't really think in those terms. Donald Trump thinks he wants revenge when something bad happens, and he's constantly in that cycle. Now, my takeaway from watching the Treasury Secretary this Sunday was that the administration seems very out of touch with what the American people want. I mean, CBS came out with a poll today that shows 92% of Americans want this war to end as soon as humanly possible. And Ariel, I think historians will record that given numbers like that, this is likely to be seen as the most unpopular war a president has ever started, at least at the beginning of that war. And wars tend not to get more popular. You layer on to that the Homeland Security and economic implications, and it's not looking good for the administration.
So, Michael, the president again wrote this on social media, quote, "They want to make a deal. I don't." Do we think that Iran at this stage of the game is back-channeling that they want a deal here? And is this a potential off-ramp for the president to kind of coalesce to public opinion, or is it unlikely to happen?
Well, if there is back-channeling, I mean, the reporting suggests that the Iranians are actually playing hardball from their negotiating point of view. They think that they're winning the war simply by surviving. There's been very little indication to show cracks in the regime. There was an Emirati official who came out today and basically said, we're not looking for a temporary ceasefire here. We want an indefinite state in which Iran cannot pose a threat to the region. Why? One of the demands Iran is apparently making is all U.S. bases in the Gulf should be vacated. And that's not something that the Kuwaitis, the Saudis, the Emiratis, or the Qataris would like to see. I mean, our military presence in the region has been, sort of one of the safeguards for these countries for decades. And indeed, I mean, what Iran is doing, we talk a lot about Trump's miscalculation here, and I completely agree. I don't think he's thought this through, and I don't think he has much strategic foresight, whatever. I think he's kind of making it up as he goes along. But the Iranians in their retaliation are also playing a dangerous game here, because now they're getting the Gulf states to be much more aggressive, expel their diplomats, and possibly even commit military assets to retaliate on their behalf. Also, we've seen in this missile strike, 2 missiles actually targeting Diego Garcia, a joint U.S.-UK base in the Indian Ocean, that Iran now has the capability to fire well beyond what we thought that they could do. This was like 4,000 kilometers. Apparently, it was an older missile that they'd modified with a shorter payload. But that's sending an indication to the Europeans that their cities are now in range. So Iran, we should also understand, if there's mission creep on the American side, and I completely think that there is, and I've not spoken to a single military expert who tells me, in order to get rid of that 60% enriched uranium that's buried under the rubble, you need to put boots on the ground. You need commandos and special forces operators to do that, right? But the Iranians are doing their own kind of mission creep, perhaps unintentionally, by provoking countries that they have otherwise had pretty equitable relationships with, not only in their immediate neighborhood, but elsewhere, in the world, such as European countries that wanted no part of this war to begin with. So this is a very long way of saying, I don't see this winding down in the short term. The Israeli chief of staff said they're only halfway through. That means at least another 4 weeks of an aerial campaign against Iran.
Yeah, you kind of went exactly, you covered a lot of ground there, Michael, but you kind of went exactly where I wanted to ask you, which is the Gulf states have essentially telegraphed to President Trump, finish the job. I want to get your thoughts on how likely it is that we see that they join in on this. And then we also now have those 22 nations and the head of NATO saying that this does pose a threat to Europe. What is all of this signaling?
Well, I think, what the Iranians have done, and perhaps this is a miscalculation or they just don't care because they're out for blood and revenge. They've targeted civilian infrastructure in places like Dubai and the UAE. They're not going after military hard targets. They're going after soft targets. Now, if something gets through and kills scores of people, an apartment building goes up in flames or a shopping mall or something like that, I think it's going to be very, very hard to keep some of these Gulf states from retaliating. And if that happens, that is going to only give Donald Trump a lot of incentive, a lot of ballast. He'll feel like he now has a coalition after the fact, if you see what I mean. And if the Europeans, I mean, already the Brits have said that we can use their air bases for launching campaigns into Iran. If the Brits start to commit assets to, conduct sorties and bombing campaigns in Iran, I mean, you're looking at something almost approaching Gulf War I rather than Gulf War II, except in this case, the coalition is built in the middle of the campaign, not well in advance of it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, a retroactive coalition of the willing. Miles, let's talk about the security on the home front. Trump is facing political pressure, but there's also concern about security. Of course, we see the DHS shut down. What concerns do you believe the DHS official should be expressing to the president the longer this war goes on?
Well, look, I'll give you my bottom line up front. I don't think we are safe in the homeland right now. And whether or not you think this was a necessary war abroad, it is almost certainly a nightmare here at home. And maybe that's in the long run, maybe that's in the short run. We don't know yet. But all I can tell you is what I would have done if I was still at DHS, which is we would have provided the White House with assessments of homeland blowback before the war. And if that didn't dissuade them from going to war, we would have run war games in preparation. And if that didn't dissuade them, we would have at least issued bulletins across America about the threat, dramatically heightened the national security posture, and pulled people off of deportation operations to put them on counterterrorism. But Ariel, none of those things have been done. None of those things have been done. In fact, reports indicate that the White House has actively tried to prevent some of those things have done. So not only are we in a heightened which is only likely to grow, even if the war ends. The Iranians won't forget. We have an administration not wanting to take the defensive actions because they don't want to project that this is a threat to the homeland. To put that another way, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's what I worry about. This is about the worst case scenario you could imagine from a homeland security perspective. And it's something, unfortunately, that may only be fixed by tragedy.
So we know that Iran has its finger on the pulse of American public opinion. You cited that CBS poll. This war is unpopular. How concerned are you that the fact that DHS has a partial shutdown right now, we're losing TSA agents? Does Iran know that? And does it impact the way they pursue their war?
Well, Michael made a good point earlier about Iran being careful, or at least needing to be careful about the targets it strikes so that it doesn't draw unnecessary support into the U.S. coalition. The biggest mistake the Iranians could possibly make right now would be to immediately strike the homeland in a significant way, because you'd have a lot of people who are anti-war in this country, which is huge majorities of the population, suddenly go in favor of the war because they would have a rally around the flag effect. So that would be a big mistake. Now, I say that with a huge asterisk, which is that the Iranians will desire in the long run to get revenge against the United States homeland. Mark my words, it's what they did after the killing of Soleimani. It's why they targeted Donald Trump for assassination and his lieutenants. And as you note, Ariel, the fact that DHS has been shut down really makes the U.S. homeland vulnerable to some of those sort of strategic efforts the Iranians might take, perhaps targeted cyber attacks to send a message to the United States. And that is something that Donald Trump did willingly. He knew the department was shut down. He took the nation to war without trying to reopen the department, and it remains shut down. This is like going into the Super Bowl without your defensive team and saying, we can win the whole game on offense. No war can win the whole game on offense. No combatant can win it only with offense. So again, the question is, will the Iranians overexert themselves or not? And that's the only thing, frankly, I think right now that gives me any solace is I suspect the Iranians will be wary of the type of terrorist attack they could be capable of on the U.S. homeland. And remember, the Iranians have committed some of the most sophisticated terrorist attacks of the past 100 years, the Iranians or their proxies. They are able to do it. Whether or not they do something like that is the question.
And we will all be watching. Michael Weiss and Defiance.org founder Miles Taylor, thank you both. Appreciate your analysis.